We're just getting started. My name is Shakil. My pronouns are he and him. I'm co-founder of Anima Leadership. Thank you for joining us today as we do the third part of this series that we're calling Tools for Compassion and Justice Leadership. And today's topic is authentic leadership in a post-truth world, in a post-truth workplace. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. With that, first of all, what is post-truth? Post-truth was Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year in 2016, and it's circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, lots of people associate this post-truth world with Trump. And while that's entirely true, that is too narrow of a focus because we have not gotten here because of one person. We've gotten here because of a series of steps that have been happening over the decades. And this includes 40 years of neoliberal economics, starting from the mid-'80s, which have just created incredibly dire circumstances and economic desperation, even though the GDPs of countries like Canada and the US have literally grown 4 to 6 times since that time period. But we are not feeling the effects of that if we are middle class or working class or poor. The war on terror, 9/11, it really normalized us versus them and this idea of living under siege, which also includes a reduction of civil liberties. So we've been in a context where us and them has been trained into a generation or two of people. Now, that's been accompanied by advertising-driven news media, where sensational and entertainment has been prioritized over important and that which is newsworthy, meaning that there used to be a time period where the 1 hour of news that used to come on in the evening between 6 and 7 was sacred. This was time in which there was no advertising because governments actually believed that news needed to be unadulterated by things like trying to get eyeballs to the screen. Well, trying to get eyeballs to watch the screen has meant that sensational has showed up much more. Entertainment, where the kinds of things that news anchors do today would have been unheard of 20 or 30 years ago. That's been a factor. That's tied to increased media choice, which has led to media bubbles, echo chambers, all kinds of social fragmentation. Of course, that has been accompanied by the disinformation by social media, bots, AI, right-wing media has been a big driver in that. And even back in the days when right-wing media was really on AM radio and has just increased its presence over time. Now, of course, in this time period, you can't have complete corruption without the rise of deeply dishonest leaders, con artists, and what's known as conflict entrepreneurs in both media and politics. And conflict entrepreneurs are basically individuals and organizations that just gleefully benefit financially or just from perspective of power of just continuing to add fuel to the fire. 2008 economic crisis didn't help. Neither did that same time the election of Barack Obama, which just enraged the US far right. The idea of a black man being the president of a white country was just too much for many, many individuals on the right. Unlimited campaign contributions in US elections. That started in about 2010, although money's always been a big factor. It became completely unlimited starting 2010. And the impact of the US is that there's just the rise of copycat right-wing nationalist and populist movements and strategies across Canada and Europe and filtering onto other parts of the world. So the post-truth world that we are living in is in a context and is really important. And there's other factors too. These are just some of the big ones that I've gravitated towards. And you could add more. So if you got things you want to add, please add them into chat. All that to say, it's not just Donald Trump, which means getting rid of Donald Trump is not going to fix all these other elements. It's a bigger problem. Okay, so fundamentally what happens is the rich get rich and the rest of us are taught to turn on each other. And that's how the dynamics work. And in this post-truth context, as cliched as it is the people that are invested with the most money that have the most to gain, while the rest of us just turn on each other and are taught to turn on each other through all of the factors that we've described. Now, what does that have to do with the workplace? How does post-truth show up in the workplace? Because that's really important. It's not just political discussions that we're talking about here. Post-truth in the workplace shows up in a variety of different ways. First of all, if you've been following any organization that has usually hit the news because of some kind of human rights issue, some kind of malpractice kind of issues, you'll often hear things about cultures of fear and toxic workplaces. Well, this is how the post-truth lives in the workplace. And in fact, the ugly truth is it's always been in the workplace. So we know, for example, nearly 1 in 2 women and roughly 3 in 10 men report experiencing harassment, sexual assault in the workplace. We know that that in the US, 40% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace. We know that racial harassment accounts for almost 30% of all claims at the EEOC in 2024, and that 40 to 50% of Black employees in both Canada and the US report experiencing discrimination and unfair treatment in the workplace. So cultures of fear and toxic workplaces often have systemic forms of discrimination underlying them. And that's unfortunately always been the case, long before Trump ever arrived on the scene. So the symptoms of post-truth in the workplace look like this: covering up harassment and discrimination by powerful leaders, an absence of oversight and accountability mechanisms for leaders, workplace cultures that discourage speaking up and whistleblowing, organizational cultures that reward charismatic, narcissistic leaders, unhealthy aggression, and competition. And let's be clear, I'm not just talking about corporate culture here. This is in the public context. This is sometimes found in the not-for-profit context. So there's a challenge here that is across all sectors. Financial fraud and theft of organizational resources. All of these are at play. Now, what you see inside organizations is what I call cultural distress factors. There's things that are going on. So on a micro level, leaders dismissing concerns or contradictory voices. An unwillingness or inability to receive and act on feedback from employees and stakeholders. This is something that we see all the time. An absence of policies and practices that focus on harassment, anti-discrimination, conflict management, as well as conflict of interest rules. Where misappropriation of ideas and work go unchecked or are actually rewarded. Where silos amplify distrust or hostility between departments and employees. Where managers are unwilling or unable to hold employees accountable. So with that, as we start widening this definition of post-truth, what else would you add to this list? What else makes sense as we're talking about post-truth? Jump in, add something to chat, or let's hear a couple of voices. What else would you add to this list? So Eli's talking about gaslighting, of course. Yeah, that shows up. Toxic positivity. Yeah, that can be a variation of it. Unwillingness to talk about what's actually challenging or difficult. Bystander effect, sure. What else? Nepotism, 100%. Yep. Nepotism is a big part of that. Yeah, fear on disagreement. Yeah, that's all aspects of psychological safety. Yeah. Lack of transparency. Yeah. Yeah. Head in the sand. Backtracking on policies and procedures. Yep. Janet, you are not alone when you're thinking about the that postmodern theories have been a double-edged sword because the aspect of truth is now being has been hijacked by the right to create alternative facts. You're right. Um, Exhaustion, increasing divides, compromising values to survive. Niceness is a tool. Yep. Patty, go ahead. Patty Ann.
I was just thinking when the what is truth was just mentioned, is it the label's a post-truth world, but is it more that it's the core of anima, feelings are driving everything.
Feelings are, but also like straight up dishonesty is.
Yes, yeah. So not to minimize truth or untruth or what is truth, but that feelings seem to be driving things more than in the past, or
Well,
have control of the reins more.
feelings have been amplified, but negative feelings. I don't
Right.
have problems with people's feelings. I have problems when feelings are and emotions are being purposefully directed towards destructive outcomes.
Right. Okay.
And we're activating hate and we're activating fear, or leaders are activating fear and activating hate. Those are powerful emotions that are being manipulated.
Oh, yeah. Someone just put in weaponized emotions. That's helpful.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So, weaponized emotions, lack of diversity in leadership, all these things matter. Um, Irate expectations of quick responses and reactions for issues that benefit from time and consideration, nuance. Yeah. In the workplace, certain people believed to have the freedom to lie, and those of color who are not believed, who are often telling the truth. Right. Yeah. And some of that is intentional, and some of that is just simply a matter of not understanding and not seeing how patterns of discrimination work. So there's intentionality and ignorance that also play out in that. If you can't see how systemic patterns play out, if you're not even aware of patterns around gender or race and things like that, so when issues are raised, then the response, well, of course that can't, we don't have racism in our workplace. We don't have sexism in our workplace. And an entire perspective is invalidated. Aisha.
So that was my comment. Thank you for that. I just wanted to add to it. Um, so yes, I agree with everything you're saying. It's empowering on for the one person to be able to lie, but they also have this approach where, well, I would never do it. So if I don't do it and they're telling me that they don't do it and we're the same race and same color, well, then it can't be true. And so
Right.
that is something that's really hard to break through because yes, you might not do it, but they are definitely doing it. And that's a barrier. And I agree with you on the hate. It's just so amplified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's great, Aisha. Yeah, so the things that I want to then focus on is what are some of the strategies and places that we can go to that might be supportive. So and so you folks are already talking about this already. So Um, what we're talking about here, if you want to prevent um, a post-truth workplace, the foundation is ethical and inclusive leadership. Like that's the foundation. That's what we're talking about. It's the lack of ethics. It's the lack of oversight. It's the lack of these things that basically amplify what we're seeing in society at large, which is why workplaces have been living in a post-truth world for some time. It's just we haven't talked about it that way. And it's important that we do and make those links. Now, if you've been part of Anima courses or training, you'll know that the foundation for this requires relational intelligence, emotional intelligence. This is the whole skill set that's related to self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, community building, brave conversations. This is the deeply relational work that we need to be able to do. It's also about creating psychological safety. And if you have the relational intelligence, then you are more likely to be able to create psychological safety. And we did the September session on that, which is really important. And psychological safety is your ability to speak up, to voice contradictory, challenging perspectives without the fear of retaliation. And the fear of retaliation is the defining factor of psychological safety. So we do that, and you take the baby steps by creating all the small and large ways that people get comfortable with giving feedback. Are you a team that is comfortable doing check-ins? Just see how people are doing. At Anima practices on a scale of 1 to 10, how you doing today? That's a practice, and that's a baby step towards the bigger steps, because going from, hey, we just want you to be able to have brave conversations, that's too big of a leap. You've got to build in, leaders have to build in all the steps in between to get us there. Accountability and transparency is a critical part of ethical inclusive leadership. This is both the policies that we've talked about and practices. And how do you make it so that everyone knows that we've got these policies and practices? Now, communication protocols, these are really important. What I mean by communication protocols for both group building and crisis situations. So this spring, winter and spring, some of the cafes we focused on was how do you talk about world events when they spill into your workplace? What are your protocols for that? How do you do that? Because the reality is that the world is going to continue, and world crises, Israel and Palestine, there will be another issue like the murder of George Floyd. There'll be other issues that are related to #MeToo and other issues that we cannot yet anticipate. What are your protocols? What have you learned through the last 4 years of crises, including COVID? What has your organization learned? And what protocols have you developed to be able to deal with these issues? Are you an organization that thinks you need to respond to every single issue? Are you an organization that has mapped out your key constituents, your key stakeholders, and found the places where your values really align and where they might be in friction? Have you done that kind of mapping so you can anticipate how to try to respond to things? Really, really important things. And those are protocols. But also, what are you doing inside your organization? Are you an organization that, because you've been creating feedback-rich environments, are you able to do things like host listening circles when things are tough, even if they're optional, right? And your organizations are like, oh, big issue just happened. Black lives is really big in the news because the murder of George Floyd. Let's call a town hall meeting because it seems like it's the right thing to do. Well, that may or may not be the right thing to do, depending on what your organization is used to. Frequently, those kind of things can rupture and go the wrong way, or they can go well because you've been doing things in your organization steadily that allow for that kind of space to happen. So what are your communication processes? And a lot of that is tied to what's the pre-work you've done? What's the group building you've done? What are the things you do that allow people to be themselves, that have these conversations so that when crisis hits, you have a platform on which to build from? And the last thing that is tied to this is EDI literacy. You can't do this work without having an understanding of the systemic forms of racism and sexism, how they show up in micro and macro ways, how they show up and in the context of a school, if a parent walks in and principal and a parent is upset and says, my child, your teacher's racism, and the first thing the principal does is say something like, well, no, that's, racism, that's not something that happens in our school. If you respond like that, it means that the leader does not have an understanding of how racism manifests. It doesn't have to be in the overt, ugly ways. It's more often in the subtle, innocuous, prioritizing and deprioritizing of people's experiences based on their identity. If you don't know those ways that micro and macro microaggressions, unconscious biases, you don't understand how they tie to systemic forms of discrimination, then you really are going to have a hard time trying to create a workplace that can challenge a post-truth world, because in essence, you're manifesting the post-truth world. You're manifesting a situation in which there's a whole reality that is unexamined and won't be examined. So those are some of the things that are foundational in moving forward. There's many others, and I'd be happy to hear other folks' opinions on this as well. But what I'd like for you to do right now is let's just take a moment and kind of reflect on the things we've talked about today. And we'll get into some group discussions. What's helpful today, and what are your questions and clarifications? So first of all, let's just start with what did you find helpful from thinking about the workplace and leadership in a post-truth world? And then let's get into conversations as well. What did you find helpful today? So there's a number of issues around context. Say more about that. I mean, Kathy, you talked about it. Patty Ann, you talked about it. Aisha, you talked. What was it? What's helpful about that? Eli, Patty Ann. Eli, did you want to respond to that? Or do you have something else you wanted to respond to?
It's related, I think, of just, one takeaway of kind of realizing the power I have to respond in the way I want to, even if it's not how I see leadership or the organization doing it. And then on the context piece, I think, you know, I don't want this to be oversimplified, but sometimes just acknowledging what's happening, whether, last week, acknowledging that the election happened without necessarily taking a side or getting into it, but just acknowledging that people on the team may be feeling certain things or experiencing certain things, and just having that basic knowledge or acknowledgement that there's more things happening in the world than just our jobs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Patty Ann?
So I work in the world of online comments, and I would say prior to 2016, I could see the feelings and the emotion changing and the anger, but and I can think of some examples off the top of my head, but it was really helpful to have that bigger list of concrete real life things that have contributed to that shift in sentiment or overtness, willingness to put that sentiment out there.
Great. Great. Thank you. Other folks, other comments? Himmel, you mentioned about community building. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think when you pointed it out, I was like, oh man, that makes so much sense. But I don't think we often talk about leaders, especially non-senior exec leaders, as community builders, but it's so needed. And it was nice to see it. And I think the leaders that I found are really effective are the ones who do build community. And so I was like, I knew this innately, but I've never seen it articulated in a corporate, perspective.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, in the corporate world, it's called team building. I call it community building. But ultimately, it's bringing people together and getting them so that they can be connected, vulnerable, and in order to give each other the benefit of the doubt when things get hard, and to collaborate. And we tend to do that better when we know who we're working with. Right. Um, Other comments, other reflections that people have?
Shakil, it's Louise. I don't know how to do the hand signal
Hey,
here. Sorry about that. Yeah.
jump in, great.
I appreciated like when I think of the context and the patterns that you identified, for me, I sit with we are the system. Like we are the system. And it is really, and I would really like to just blame Trump. That's what I want to do. And I know if I do that, then I'm not doing my own work. And um I'm forgetting that I'm also part of the system. And yeah, it just feels like it's a Trump. Yeah, it's just bigger than Trump. So I appreciated you
Yeah.
naming those patterns. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I have a question for you folks, and maybe you could write this into chat, and I'd like to have a discussion, which is um um what brought you here today to this particular topic? Because I think we come in with certain kinds of ideas potentially. And I know some people may be here just because, you like coming to Anima cafes, but this particular topic, what I'm curious for, my question to you is, what has brought you here? What is the feeling or the need that brought you to this workshop, which is titled Authentic Leadership in a Post-Truth World, or for a Post-Truth World? So, what drew you here? I'm curious.
It's Petra. Uh, what with what you just said, what brought me here is I'm listening to a lot of different analysis about what happened with the election, is that the urgency and the need for regrouping for people, I don't want to say on the left, but people who are building and designing a new world is the opportunity to really start strengthening and building those models and being that leader of speaking truth to power and amplifying the alternative, because as far as I can see, what Trump is going to do is just bring down capitalism even faster than it already is falling. So how are we ready? What can we do? And how do we want to live together in the future? These are all big thoughts, but it's all stepping into not knowing, which is scary, but also exciting because it's new and there's possibility there.
That's interesting. Thank you. Julie.
I think for me, it's coming together with a group of people who are willing to have and sit with that truth and have those hard conversations and to process together. And I really look forward to the conference actually as well, in terms of here we are all isolated. A time in history right now that is very poignant, right? I mean, Trump was in power, and then I had hope again, and now that hope was removed, and there's this sense of dread, discouragement, and fear. And I'm looking for ways as a leader to help others through this, but also to shift that. And I see this as community, as coming together, as as not giving away the power to divide us. So that's you know, I think the tools and the community are key to how we're going to get through this.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. So I'm seeing other comments like this: hope and guidance, how to stay inspired and continue moving EDI forward, to understand where we are today, and just being in community, feeling depressed, feeling down, fully understand it. I've ignored news for the better part of a week. uh, uh, Iman, Iman, can you say something more about the lack of critical thinking and nuance? Um, can you say a little more?
Yeah, sure. Turn my camera on. Hi. Yeah, so I was really conflicted with this election. I have to say, I didn't want Kamala Harris to win because for me, genocide was a red line. And so I didn't want her to win, but I also was not happy to have Trump win. And so there's that conflict. And I personally am really frustrated with the way folks are looking at the election results and saying that, yes, there was misogyny and yes, there was racism, but I feel that even there was no there was no looking at the type of campaign that Harris ran. That she veered hard to the right, very pro-police, very pro-military. She campaigned with Cheney. So that really alienated her base. And so I feel that, there's a lot of very superficial analysis of why she lost. And yes, Trump is a horrific figure to think that we have that he'll be president again for the second time, that someone could actually lose to Trump, but she ran a terrible race and she didn't have much time. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but I feel that there's been a lot of oversimplification in the analysis to the election. And so that's one of the reasons why I was here. I'm curious to just see where the conversation goes.
And because this is really for the workplace context, did you find parts of this helpful?
Yes, I mean, I found in particular the beginning, the context, right? In terms of how we got here, I found that to be very helpful. Although there's one point that I'm still noodling is that when you mentioned Barack Obama and the reaction to the far right, yes, I agree with that. And I believe that he also accelerated this post-truth, that I feel that, that it's not just a one-sided analysis in terms of, both Democrats and Republicans contributed to this post-truth world that we're in. So,
Oh, 100%. There's no doubt about that.
yeah.
We can argue and say that, the impact may be asymmetrical, but they've both contributed. And since, the late 90s, mid 90s onwards, Clinton onwards, it's been, since the 80s, really, there's been a consolidation of more and more power in the executive, which is pushed in this direction. So we've seen lots of factors. There's no doubt the polarization is not one-sided. It's asymmetrical, though. I mean, there's a different investment that conservatives can have. And I'm talking about more the far right that's really pulled conservative body as a whole really far right. So things that were once on the margins are now in the center, and that has been a process. And again, when people aren't desperate, those are hard things to do. But when people are desperate, we will believe many things. And so disinformation and desperation are two unfortunate, um, unfortunate sort of like connections that really can make us spiral. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for that, Iman. All right. Any other comments or reflections that people have about today? Kathy, did you have a hand up?
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I felt the context was really great. I just wonder if we could, if there's going to be room or time to dive into some of the countering pieces, just because I think there were 5 things that I took copious notes and there was so much great information shared, but I just wondered if there will be an opportunity to dive into those 5 different kind of ways we can counter
Sure.
post,
So,
yeah, how
well,
are we react?
we have a little bit of time today, so I'm happy to unpack some of this a bit further if there are things that you would like to talk more about. So we've got these 5 things. Is there any particular area you want to unpack?
I guess for me, it's knowing that we have these 5 points. Like, how do we, in the limited, some of us with limited influence at our companies, I mean, how do we kind of help equip people with these tools? I guess, like, what's the next step after knowing all this? I mean, it's kind of hard to, yeah, I guess I don't know where to go next after knowing that these are the things that might help counter some of that post-truth
So
world leadership.
so each of you is in a different place in a different organization, in a different context. So there's not one step. Each organization will be at a different place as to where they can hook into that. Some organizations have already done a lot of work around emotional intelligence and brave conversations. So there's ways that that if that's the case, you're at a different starting point than organizations that have not done any work in those areas, right? Now, so I can't answer something that's universal for everybody. However, there are some things that can be helpful in most contexts. One is, especially if you're in a place where you don't have a lot of influence. What sector are you working in, by the way?
Media.
Media. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So media, and depending on where in media you're working, um, I'm just a big believer that everything has to be done in groups. So, we don't do this on our own. In essence, what you're doing is if you're inside organizations where there's not a lot of traction, um, you gather people. You gather people, and whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 people that can start having these conversations. And then from there, um, look for leaders that seem open to some of these issues. So it's a relationship building process. So some people are really this is a grassroots initiative. We have to we can't, our leaders are not on board, or our leaders were sort of on board, but now in the new political context, they've backed away from things like EDI. So, the conversations here are always done in groups. Don't be alone. Whether it's workshops you attend, find people that are like-minded. And from there, you do both conversation, you do and you do some strategizing about, well, who else can we bring into the circle? How do we widen our influence? Is it through an employee resource group? Is it through an opportunity with a leader? Sometimes it requires a lot of patience. Sometimes it just requires you walking into a different room and there's people already talking about these things, right? So I would say that, depending on where your organization is, it's easier to have this. For example, you might not be able to talk about all 5 of these things because your organization isn't ready. But what leaders are talking about accountability in your organization? If they are, that's someone I want to talk to. And you know, work with their, how can I support what you're doing around accountability? I think it's really important. I also think it's important for this idea of psychological safety. So some of it is who you're connecting to and finding, and then the other part is developing your own knowledge and awareness in each of these areas. You know, we did an entire cafe on psychological safety. Go check it out or do some research on it and know some of the things that you want to say. So when you're talking to people, you are a little bit ahead of them. So this is time you got to put in. And unfortunately, with the context that we're in, it will require a lot of us to do this off the side of our desks in our personal lives because we care and because there might not be that other time. And other places, maybe there's little spaces where you can eke out in your workplace time where that's actually a committed part because you can say, hey, I'd like to do a presentation for our staff team on psychological safety because I think it's really important. I've been reading a lot about it and I'm wondering whether that might be okay. And then you know, you've got a little bit of time to do something at a meeting, even for 15 minutes. So there's different ways that you can up your own skills because you are the instrument for change and then you influence other people. And those are probably the 2 most basic steps to then getting more strategic because you get strategic with other people and then you have more impact. Is that an okay starting point?
Yes, thank you. I think I know basically what to do, but I'm also just a little frozen and numb right now. So thank you very much.
Being frozen and numb is actually okay, right? Because maybe right now it's a week after the election. Maybe it's okay. Your body just needs to thaw, needs to do something that is just about self-regulation and calming yourself down. After the election last week, we had a staff meeting, and literally I spent most of the staff meeting because we were debriefing or trying to debrief the election. I spent a bunch of time staring out the window. Our team spent a lot of time just in silence. And words came out in stilted ways. But this idea of thawing, my colleague Rebecca is here. She's relative to me, she's one of the younger people because I'm gray and she's not. And I said something and I started a thought and I said, you know, I think maybe some of the things we could do is eat good food. And that's all I had. I just like blanked out. I had nothing else to offer. And Rebecca was like, that's it? That's all you got? Eat good food? and and um and I said, yeah, that's all I got. And we laughed for about 5 or 10 minutes. And then I was like, but maybe that's all we can do right now is if you're frozen, maybe it just boils down to 3 words. Directions you give yourself for self-care right now is to get out of that frozen state by doing things that are 3-word directions to you. And they include a verb and they include a noun, but nothing more complicated than that. And that's self-care. And so walk with friends, you know, um, uh, make yummy soup, like whatever it might be that's helping, because this is not a sprint. So I guess what I'm also saying is that it's okay for us to go through time periods where we're consciously aware that we're a little frozen and do self-care. There's other times where that frozenness is just I don't know what to do and I get unstuck by thinking my way through it. So depending on what kind of frozenness we're stuck in, and now I'm talking to everybody, sometimes it's completely okay to just self-care your way through that freeze stage. Other times, it's just about who do I need to talk to? What do I need to be inspired by? And follow your nose. And other times the freeze might need more therapeutic supports. And then we go to our therapist or counselor or community group that allows us to hold our emotions in some ways. At this point, unless you've got any questions or comments to hang out with afterwards, we invite you to come off screen and unmute yourselves and just say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
So much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.
Really appreciate it.